Welcome to Lecture 28, Jazz Origins. Jazz is an amazing art form and a truly American synthesis of many different cultures. And as we've seen around the planet, many modern, and we say modern within the last 200 years roughly, the music in most of the major Western areas of the world have pulled from many different cultures, and jazz is no exception. And it is distinctively an American style of music that developed in the early decades of the 20th century. Its roots include many Afro-American folk music traditions, such as spirituals, work songs, and the blues. It also borrowed from 19th century band music, sentimental songs, Caribbean rhythms and dance music, gospel music, and the ragtime style of piano playing. So as we're going to see, jazz is an amazing synthesis of cultures that came to the Americas. The center for jazz is generally considered New Orleans, Louisiana. And it was kind of at one time the melting pot of the Caribbean trade in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and a gateway to the north because it's at the delta of the Mississippi River. It's thought to be the city where most of the early cultural influences created jazz. In other words, where there was enough of a melting pot of different kinds of cultures and enough traditions and enough freedom in the city in post-Civil War, largely due to the French influence, that there was a wonderful melting pot, a wonderful place to cook all of these styles into new styles, as we will see. So the historical influences go back to ancient Atlantic slave trade. And you'll see in the map that's on the right hand of the slide that the slave trade pretty much was the manufactured goods that were made in Europe, and they helped create ships. And this goes back to the 1490s and the 1500s, especially beginning with the Portuguese, who enslaved West African people, took them over to the Caribbean area and eventually to almost all the way across North America, where raw materials were gathered and then sent back to the old world in Europe for manufacture. And the current estimates are that it was about 12 million to 2.8 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. Now think about this, over a span of 400 years. The vast majority of those enslaved Africans were employed in plantation agriculture and were field hands. Even on plantations, however, they worked in other capacities. Some were domestics and worked as butlers, waiters, maids, seamstresses, and launderers. Others were assigned as carriage drivers, hostlers, and stable boys. But the sad part of this, of course, is that they were enslaved people and did not have individual freedom. But they were incredibly resilient people and actually amazing people who brought with them the music and the traditions of Africa. And so the slaves brought knowledge of West African musical instruments like drums, zithers, xylophones, and the banjo. And some slave owners would even allow them to play, or they insisted that they play music on plantations. The tribal dances from West Africa morphed into something called step dances, and tribal melodies became song styles like the shout and the echo. A lot of this is call and response music, which greatly influenced jazz. And their work songs, dance tunes, and religious music, and the syncopated, remember on the offbeat and emphasis, swung, remixed, rocked, and rapped music of their descendants would become the lingua franca of American music. That means the language of the country of American music, eventually influencing Americans of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and virtually all styles of popular music started out in the jazz world, especially the blues. So here are the biggest influences from the 19th century: minstrel shows, sentimental songs, Civil War military bands, early blues, ragtime, gospel music, folk songs, and Caribbean music. We might even say classical music as well, in terms of scales and notes and things like chords. that were used, but they all influenced each other. So the minstrel shows were a form of racist entertainment developed in the early 19th century. And each show consisted of comic skits, variety acts, dancing, and music performances that depicted people specifically of African descent. The sad part of this was the shows were performed by mostly white people in makeup called blackface for the purpose of playing the role of black people. There were also some African American performers and black-only minstrel groups that formed and toured. The minstrel shows lampooned black people as dim-witted, lazy, buffoonish, superstitious, and happy-go-lucky. So they maintained the myths about how the slave people and the African people were really not that intelligent and not that sophisticated. Nothing could be further from the truth. It was the biggest lie of the 1800s. But this became incredibly popular music. The only plus side was that it started to introduce African American music to the broad culture. And can you imagine, this was the most famous and popular form of entertainment up until just after the end of the Civil War, and then vaudeville took over. And we still had remnants of minstrel shows and variety shows on television and things all the way up through the 1970s, if you can imagine. But the only positive, like I said, was that African American music got pushed into these shows and it disseminated that. The next were sentimental songs. A sentimental ballad is an emotional style of music that often deals with romantic and intimate relationships, and to a lesser extent, loneliness, death, war, drug abuse, politics, and religion, usually in a poignant but solemn manner. Ballads are generally melodic enough to get the listener's attention. One of the great examples of the balladeer of the 1800s was Stephen Foster. He wrote songs like "Oh Susanna" that became extremely popular. They were popular in minstrel shows, they were popular sheet music, and many of these sentimental songs were played in parlors and they were played in dance halls. They influenced jazz in terms of giving melodic and cultural material. The next were instruments and two-step music from Civil War brass bands and eventually New Orleans street bands. So these two-step pieces were patriotic songs for each side of the Civil War. And each side of the Civil War had their own brass bands that were in regiments. And things like "May God Save the Union," "John Brown's Body," that Julia Ward Howe made into the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and the South's "Dixie," originally a pre-war minstrel show song. "God Save the South," "God Will Defend the Right." Both the North and the South had their own songs. But the thing about most of this music was it had a two-step beat. And we kind of hear that today as marches or polkas. Well, that influenced jazz as well. And then women would do turning dances because they had big hoop skirts to kind of keep them out of the way. And dances were popular during this period, like the polka, the schottische, and as I mentioned, the two-step and the waltz. Well, after the Civil War, many of these bands broke up and they pawned their instruments. And then African Americans and other people merely bought them from pawn shops and started to learn how to play them and created their own street bands with their own style. And these street bands would play at funerals, at celebrations, at holidays and parades. And New Orleans was famous for having parades almost every day. Then, probably the single most important influence to jazz and then pop music in the United States was early blues. And there were two styles: Delta blues, which was a solo male singer with a guitar, and then classic blues, which is usually a female singer with a small band. So here we have two pictures of those. And we're going to watch a video about the importance of blues and its influence in music we listen to all the time today. And then gospel music. Hymns and sacred songs were often repeated in call and response fashion. And that's an African tradition, but it became a part of jazz as well. And most of the churches relied on hand clapping and foot stomping as rhythmic accompaniment. That's also African. And most of the singing was done a cappella. That means without instruments. And the first published use of the term gospel song probably appeared around 1874. So about 9 years after the end of the Civil War. And black gospel, by far the most well-known variant, emerged out of the African American music tradition and has evolved in various ways over the years, continuing to form the basis of black church worship even today. And most Southern Baptist worship, big congregational worship, and it's extremely popular. And many, many artists came out of that church background with tremendous skills, not only singing, but playing keyboards like organ and other instruments, and then began to incorporate those into popular music. Then 19th century American folk songs. Now, this derives from various European and African influences, including English ballads, Irish and Scottish traditional music, especially fiddle music, hymns, and African American blues. They all kind of blended together. And they were the first vocal group to become country music stars, a beginning of the divergence of country from traditional folk music. And this mostly happened at the beginning of the recording industry, when records start to be made. And people then could listen to music all around the country. And you'll notice the three players in this Appalachian picture are playing three instruments that originally came from Africa. That's what's so amazing to me. And then Caribbean music. And we studied a lot about Caribbean music, about South American music, about Mexican music. And the danzón is especially significant as the first African American music ever recorded, in a style known to have been performed in New Orleans beginning in the late 1880s. So there are many parallels in the form of the music, the rhythm, the styles that exist between the danzón and what's known as the Dixieland repertoire, or the early traditional jazz repertoire, and that instrumentation associated with the final hot jazz, which was partially improvised, had similarities to the clarinet, trumpet, trombone front lines of Dixieland. So the danzón may well have contributed directly to the development of jazz. Even Jelly Roll Morton, one of the famous self-proclaimed inventors of jazz, who really didn't invent it, but got things published and was quite a gifted songwriter and pianist and entrepreneur. He said that it wasn't jazz unless it had that Latin tinge. And by that he was referring to that rhythm. So we'll see that all these influences come together to make American jazz, a truly an American synthesis of the melting pot of this culture. In your assignment, same as usual, watch the featured videos, answer the questions found in the Google Doc quiz. See you in class. Thank you.